Hey everybody, thank you for tuning into Boicestrous. This is Benjamin Boyce, and this is our first interview episode, and I'm very excited to bring it to you. In this episode, I sat down and had a conversation interview with Terry Mattson. Terry has been a pastor for over 20 years at the West Seattle Church of the Nazarene. Terry is a great guy, and we had a great conversation. I've known him for a couple years now, and I would consider him a friend. Hopefully he considers me a friend too. I've known him through my fiance's family, who's known him for decades and decades, and every time I get a chance, I like to pick Terry's brain on things. So this was just a great opportunity to sit down and talk about things like religion and politics and really get his take on the issues of the day. And so we covered a wide variety of things, including the existence of God. We talked about living into the good, the problem of evil for religion, the problem of evil in man. We talked about racism and American exceptionalism, capitalism, socialism, immigration, all that good stuff. I really enjoyed our conversation. I hope you do too. And so without further ado, here's episode 4 of Boicestrous. Okay, good. Yeah.
Your job is to make me sound good.
Yeah. Oh, yes, sir. Yeah, I will. So, I have as my guest today, Terry Mattson. We're sitting here in his church in West Seattle, Jesus Christ Church of the Nazarene. Is that right?
Just Church of the Nazarene.
Just Church of the Nazarene.
I'm not sure Jesus would want to claim ownership, so whatever.
Well, why might that be?
Because we who claim to be his followers, and are, usually like the people of Israel before, and like his followers in the time of the New Testament when the church's memory was fresh, screw it up. I mean, we don't get his message well. We don't live it out well. Does he claim us? Yes. He claimed Israel, and my word, the refusal and stubbornness of these good people who he chose from before time, I think at some level, never got the message, and God never rejected them. Disciplined them, pushed them, prodded them, called to them, yes, but never abandoned them. So I don't think he abandons the church. Mm-hmm. But the truth of the matter is, we do it badly.
I see. Well, so Jesus was from Nazareth, right?
Yes.
And that's where the church gets its name.
Of the Nazarene.
Of
yes.
the Nazarene.
So we claim him.
That's pretty good.
In fact, the truth of the matter is, in its original intent, you really would have called it the Church of the Undignified, because that was the intent. We are the Church of the Nazarenes. The Nazarene was a small nothing village out in the middle of northern Israel, and outside of Judea, they considered themselves the real people. And so that was their nickname was Shoot Town. They had nothing to commend themselves. So when we take the word Nazarene, we really mean that we are supposed to be following in his steps of nothingness, of identifying with people where they really are and the brokenness of their lives. Truth is, you're sitting inside of a very old 100-year-old building that has potential of being filled with beauty. So that kind of in and of itself says that we really don't follow well, doesn't it?
Kind of, a little bit. Well, so that I've known you for a little while now, for about a year and a half or so, and I've been to your church a couple of times, and I really like it here. It's lovely. The building is 100 years old. It has an incredible amount of character. Every room is just absolutely gorgeous in its own way.
Totally agree.
And the community that you guys have here is equally gorgeous and unique in its own way too. And I've always wanted to kind of get my head around the different denominations of mm-hmm. Christianity. And you and I have talked about it mm-hmm. briefly before, because I've asked you if you could kind of give me a nutshell of it. So it sounds like you just gave me something about the Nazarene that I didn't think of before, but would it be accurate to say then, to sum up what you said, that it's sort of all about finding the community as it is wherever the church is, and then helping the people around sort of find the beauty in life and through the brokenness and all that?
Yes. In fact, the vision of the Church of Jesus, as opposed to the Nazarene Church, of which we are a part of a much larger historic community. We're not anything, we're not outside the mainstream, we're inside Christendom at its heart. But the beauty of the church is that is the purpose. God came to earth in the flesh as a way of affirming that we are made of dust, because he created us out of dust. Now the dust comes from where? The stars. So we have this dualism in us. We hunger for immortality, we hunger for the visions and dreams that we have, that the stars ever draw us forward, but the truth is we're so much dirt. And and so
just dirt bags.
Yeah, in many respects. And so the purpose of the church is to live inside the dirtiest places in the world and help recreate and restore the vision of Adam, humankind, the vision of Adam and Eve, our first parents, metaphorically, and to see God's will come to the earth just as it is done in heaven. That's the purpose.
I like that idea of it a lot, actually. And on this podcast, this would be hopefully our fourth episode that we put out, and Peter and I haven't gotten to the point where we've talked about religion, all that in very much depth. So I haven't actually talked about my religious views in the podcast, but just so it's clear, because I want that to come up during our conversation, I'm somewhere between atheist and Christian. And you and I have sort of talked about that recently too. And one of the things that's brought me...
Aren't we all?
Well, so I would love to talk about that, because one of the things that Peter and I want to do on this podcast is just be able to make some progress through conversation with people in our own beliefs and our own thoughts and our understandings about things. Because as we've grown up, we've found that some of the most fulfilling ways to get to know yourself and others and build relationships is through the spoken word. And I think that's at the heart of Christianity. It's the heart of relationships too. And so what's brought me more from the atheist...
If I can interrupt for a second.
Yeah, go ahead.
The spoken word, which jumps out of the pages of the written history of the church. See, the Bible didn't fall out of the heavens on golden tablets that were perfected and forever framed. It is a human document that arises out of one tribe over a period of 2,500 years, really. Certainly 1,500 years in the writing. And so it emerges from the dust. And the belief inside of it is that God is breathing all the way through it, both in the original events in the Jewish and Christian church as it interpreted those events. Many often reinterpreted them, reapplied them, and now even today. So I'm taking it sideways. I forgot where we're going. The only thing that I said, aren't we all? What I mean by that is, at a very personal level, we're not going to talk about my darkest secrets, because I won't give them up. Unless you have them, and then we'll talk about them. But they're there. And they're
in all of us too.
I think so.
That's true, and I know that doesn't usually make it to the surface in any given conversation, our darkest secrets, because we all have shame, and we all have an aversion to sharing the things that we're most ashamed about ourselves with others, because it makes them so real. It's like saying, I'm as bad as I think that I am when I'm by myself in my own head.
So in terms of following Jesus, I can only say that I'm being converted. Not that I am. I can only say that I'm growing into this relationship, not that I've owned it. And then the other thing that I think is true is there isn't a human intuition where I really know that I know Jesus. I don't have any doubt about that. I can't prove it to you. I can't make it real. I can't mathematically, scientifically, or rationally, or in any other way evidence it. But it is true. I know that God is, and that He loves me, and I'm in a relationship with Him, and with the whole world thereby. Having said that, I have all kinds of doubts, including my doubts about what I know that I know. So, and if I ever stop having those doubts, I've ceased to be a follower of Jesus in the deepest sense. And so, in that sense, depending on the day and on whether I've taken my meds properly or not, you might find me at the heart of atheism. So anyway, go ahead.
Well, all of that is actually pretty similar to where I think I am, or maybe where I can see myself going. And over the last couple of, maybe over the last year or so,
I've actually managed to sit down and force myself to read a lot of books that I've been meaning to read for years, and it's given me some insight into how the religious person's mind works. And at the core of it is actually the eternal struggle of faith and doubt.
Correct.
And as you just stated, if you ever cease to actually have those doubts and struggle with that on a daily basis, then you've sort of lost connection with what's at the core of
That's
your
right,
beliefs.
because the point of the word is that it comes off the pages of the text and into human form in Jesus of Nazareth. And according to the Christian tradition, by the Holy Spirit, Jesus of Nazareth, this living word, is living in us. And so if God is breathing in us, I don't know how we can't doubt.
Can I ask a question about what sounds like a contradiction but might not be?
Mm-hmm.
So as you just said, you know that God is real, but you also have regular doubts about some things. I don't know about the belief in God himself, but is that a regular doubt you have, or is that something that's concrete?
Well, as close to anything I believe that God is. I believe that God is terribly good. Good, not terribly good. That's a contradiction. But not just incredibly good, but is incapable of anything other than goodness.
The definition of goodness then would be God and the characteristics of God,
And
values
Jesus
of God.
personifies that, or makes that human,
Mm-hmm.
or real, tangible. But what makes me doubt is the reality that there is a lot in this world, including my own soul, that is not good. And I can't reconcile those two things. Now, I have a lot of good friends who have reconciled it, and it's a fairly, it started with Whitehead in the beginning of the 20th century. It was called process theology. Now it's more what's called open theology, which is to say essentially that, and this resolves the doubt issue, but I think a mystery's lost in it. So, which is, they're saying that God doesn't live apart from the universe. God lives in the universe only. And that it's coming from a postmodern perspective where the event is what is important, the continuing explosion of the miracle of molecules, the explosion of atoms, the explosion of life everywhere, that has at its very heart this seeking of unity in an incredible diverse experience. And so Whitehead and many open theologians argue that God lives inside this universe, that God is not all-powerful, not all-knowing, although God can know everything that everyone and every part of the universe, which is God in essence, is experiencing. That is satisfying in terms of resolving the issue between doubt and faith, but it's exactly that satisfaction which causes me to draw back and say,
You can't be so sure.
Not only can I not be, I don't want to be. I don't want God to simply be another part of the broken universe. I really do want God to be above it and yet immanent and loving inside of it.
Outside of it, and therefore being able to be perfect.
Exactly.
In a sense.
I want the tension. Now I have no doubt that the Trinity of God, which is essentially unique to the church, as opposed to Jewish or Islam or other even pre-personal faiths like Buddha. This idea that God is a trinity of three persons so profoundly unified in love that creates a community known as God. I want to hold on to that with my whole life, because that means several things. It means before the first rock was created, there was love. It means that before the Big Bang or whatever else brought this several billion years into space and time,
Mm-hmm.
there was a communal goodness and love that is greater than 1,000 universes, and we now have a sense of how vast the universe is, and so that's beyond our ability to imagine. And yet, that God would be faithful to the wounds of God's creation, and would so identify it that God who never experienced hatred, jealousy, anger in the sense that we experience it, that is controlling, that community of persons chose to enter into my lust, to enter into our greed, like the United States, to cooperate with that which is genius in us, and keep moving the story forward, but to taste the death inside our wounds, which is the heart of the cross, which is the heart of the Jesus story. I want very much to believe in that God, and that's like believing in a fairy tale, and so that creates doubt, the awareness of that, and yet I choose, and I mean that, I choose to not let God be anything less than that, because the alternative is boring.
Well, that's funny. So just to jump back to, because you said a lot there, and it was very interesting. I tried to keep track. So I'm gonna jump back to the argument from Whitehead, was that it? Sort of the beginning of the century. It actually sounds very much like a Stoic idea. The old Greek philosopher, Stoics. So their thought was that almost in like a deist sense, there was a God, but that it permeated everything in the material universe, and that everything sort of was made up of God particles or God atoms, and that human beings.
I think there's a sense in which that being true.
Like that's, in your view, that's true in a way, but it's also that God as an entity exists outside of the material universe as well.
I don't think there's any explosion of any molecule in the universe where God is not present. The downside of that is that puts God at the heart of the insanity and evil of Hitler. But
well, it puts God in a position where he creates a universe wherein a Hitler can exist. And so that sounds almost like
the power to end it.
And so isn't that one of the, I'll put on my atheist hat here and levy tough questions from the atheist side of you.
The problem is you're not going to be satisfied with my answer because I have that same hat on. But anyway, go ahead.
Well, I might be satisfied with it because, well, one of the reasons that I've been transitioning from the atheist camp to the Christian camp is because I've become a lot less satisfied with the materialistic questions and materialistic answers.
Ultimate emptiness.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't really touch on the spirituality or the immense depth of the human soul and the human experience. So anyway, my question is...
I'm taking you sideways and forgive me. You know why?
Why?
Because if it's only about material reality, at the end of the day, ethics don't matter. At the end of the day, the only thing that matters is power. At the end of the day, God has to be about power. And I think the very freedom of a Hitler to emerge is evidence that God is not about power. In other words...
Or the fact that Hitler collapsed is evidence that it can't be all about power.
Yes, in the most profound sense, the universe reflects God. So every experience in the universe ultimately reflects the character of a communal being who is holy and good. And so if one instead just takes materiality and power relationships at its core, then you are placing yourself against the very core of what the universe is.
So that actually makes a lot of sense to me, and it wouldn't have, a couple years ago that wouldn't have made sense. I would have thought that sounds like gobbledygook, but now I have a couple of years of lived experience where I've actually started to notice, my inner experience, and sort of my conscious has started to speak up loud enough for me to hear it, or I've started paying attention and it was always as loud as it is, something like that. But either way, I've started to notice that when I actually act in accordance with what my conscience tells me and what I believe to be
and you mean
good.
Conscience, not just consciousness, right?
I do mean conscience, yeah,
okay,
sorry, I put the emphasis on it. I've always wondered why those two, I should look up the origins of those words. But anyway, so yeah, I've noticed that when I actually act in accordance with what I think is good, almost objectively, like when I look at other people, for instance, and I say, it's almost the easiest thing in the world to judge what other people should do, Mm-hmm. When I apply that same standard to myself and I go, oh, why aren't you acting in the way that you think is good? And then I actually start to act it out in accordance with my conscience, then things actually work out for the best. And it's like, I'm not even necessarily trying to make things work out. And not for me alone. It's almost like when I actually put when I put other people before me, because I feel that that's right, and I see others around, and I think that they ought to put others before them, because I can see the consequences of when they don't. When I take that onto myself, things work out better, my relationships flourish, the individuals that I put first flourish, I flourish, the community flourishes. And so in principle, the idea that when you actually work in accordance or act in accordance with God's laws, that you're almost in harmony with the universe, you're in harmony with how things ought to be. All of that makes an infinite amount of sense to me now. And I mean infinite because
You've been reading C.S. Lewis?
I did read 2 C.S. Lewis books. Yeah,
Yes.
Just recently, actually, on a cruise, I read the Screw Tape Letters. Have you read that?
Fine.
Oh my goodness! I want to talk about that in a minute, but
Okay.
I had a question like 5 minutes ago, and I didn't get to spit it out, so I have to now. So the atheist question, I've heard it characterized as like the toughest atheist question. I don't know if that's the case, but anyway, it's the problem of evil. It's if God can be all good and He created the universe, then how can we have this problem of evil and horrific tragedies? I won't even use Hitler. Let's say Hitler. He's something else. I'm saying the infant who gets typhoid fever or malaria in Africa and dies in the cradle, something like that.
That's even harder.
Yeah.
The evil that comes from human choice is easier to deal with than what we call natural tragedies. And the answer to the natural tragedies, I have no explanation. None. I told you it'd be unsatisfying. However, I have ways that I live with it. And I'm going to go back to the personal because it still is the bridge. So when you are describing living into the good, not only does the universe expand, but those who are sentient beings, specifically humans, the people you are helping become more fully human and you become more fully human. Because and here's the difference between conscience and consciousness. Consciousness is the awareness of gifting. Conscience tells us there's a reason for the gifting, and that is the good, that is love. And if we live into that, then we become more conscious, more aware, more fully human, more like God. Even as we are keenly aware of our mortality and our humanness, and that our purpose is not to grow up and to be a God, but because our purpose is to be always dependent. My next breath may or may not come. It's not my choice. It is the universe's choice, or I believe God's choice. And so here's what I'm convinced of. And a saint of the 13th century, Julian of Norwich, those were the psychologists of those days. And she was called an anchoress. And anchoresses, there were a lot of them. There was, in the 13th, 14th, 15th century, they were abundant in the church. And they would go through a ceremony which was half funeral and half marriage. And they would dedicate their life to live inside a room that would not be much larger or bigger than the room that we are in, which is about 20 foot long and about 10 foot wide, 12 foot wide. And they would live there the rest of their life. They would never leave that room, except they would be given permission by the priest on occasion to go out into the garden and there. But their purpose was prayer. And there would be a window open into the church itself so that the nuns could come and gather the refuge and serve food, serve Holy Communion, etc. They wouldn't even participate in worship except through the window. And then there was a window out to the community, and the purpose of that window was so they could give counsel to people who came to them asking for help. They were psychologists at the time, and they were contemplative in nature. And in one of her visions, she asked God to help her see the suffering of Jesus, and she became very ill for about a year, exceedingly ill, much pain. And in that, she experienced several visions. And one of the visions she writes about, and she was very popular in her day. Her writings to this day are very popular. She had a vision where she says, where she says that sin is necessary, because when we experience the wounds of love not fulfilled, the darkness that comes when we walk away from love, that it expands the darkness into us and we want to avoid it, so we move towards the light. And so it has this this productivity and moving us away from emptiness, i.e. materialism.
If you only knew how good it was, then you wouldn't understand how good it was. You need a little bit of bad for contrast.
Exactly. And then she says, because of that, Jesus showed her that Jesus does not blame us for our sin or for falling into it. And that the cross is God's removal for every human being that's ever lived and ever will live for sin. So it extends to the entire universe. I assume it extends to Lucifer and the fallen angels, and that it covers all sentient beings in the universe. The only issue then becomes, do we live into Jesus or away from Jesus? Do we live into love or away from love? And so in one of the showings, Jesus says, I assure you that all manner of evil will be resolved. It will be healed. It will be wiped away. And when it is done, all things will be shown to be good. And then Jesus said to her, both great and small. So I have to believe. And if I didn't believe this, I would not be a Christian. That God somehow has got it all worked out, that even the worst horror that comes at this incredible risk of sentient capacity for love and fear, for doubt and faith, for anger uncontrolled, and great passion and anger that's very controlled against unrighteousness, that the dualism in all of that God has it worked out, and the cross is the splitting of it. The cross is also God's way of going inside of it and saying, you're not alone. I experience it with you. I will taste it. We in the Trinity, who never knew what death tasted like, we're going to taste the fullness of the death of your sin. And that's how we're going to work this thing out, and it's going to be worked out for everybody. If I did not believe that, I would not be a follower of Jesus.
Does that, to you, explain then the natural tragedies, just the idea that all of the sins, big and small, will be explained in the end as being good?
The Christian doctrine is the natural, and I can't give you a scientific basis for this, but I'm not certain that it's not true. The Christian doctrine, the early Jewish doctrine, is that before the human falls, that is, moving away from righteousness, that nature was in balance and that nature itself is affected. I have no idea if that's true, or if it's just necessary that you have chaos in order to get goodness. But I'll tell you what is different. In every other faith tradition of that time, of those epics, Babylonian, Sumar, all the stories from the various tribals, the chaos was the same. The whole world was filled with chaos. The difference is, all those other stories have chaos as a result of the gods. And humans were just trying to appease the gods and stay outside of all their arguments because they could get caught up in them and destroyed by them. Whereas the Jewish faith starts out with the same chaos and says that the Spirit hovered over the chaos and brought forth a world that was perfect and good. That's the first poetic, ritualistic story of creation. The second story of creation in Genesis 2 tells us that God acknowledges what is not good, the loneliness of Adam, or humankind. And so God gets down in the dirt and starts again to recreate and work with this loneliness. And that I think is satisfying. That gives me both the purpose of creation and the recognition that it's not perfect. And I can live inside such a universe if I know that God is good. If it's just a matter of rolling the dice, I have no desire to be in that universe.
I can sympathize with that. And actually, coming to an understanding just in a peacefulness in my own mind that, for one, I'm not perfect, and that the recognition of the fact that I'm not perfect being the sort of the fundamental thing you have to accept before you can set yourself out on the journey to at least aiming towards something approximating perfection, knowing that you'll never get there and you will always fall short, but that life doesn't seem to be worth the struggle if you're not at least aiming upwards for something that you can always continually strive to improve yourself on. As I thought about that when I was, I think, 20, 21, something like that, and I remember I was in the backyard and I was gardening. I decided to start up a garden because I felt like I needed to do some personal growth, personal development. And over the course of a couple of months during the summer as I was tending this garden, this sounds like it was something out of the Bible now that I'm saying it out loud, but as over the course of tending this garden, I'm like pulling weeds and I'm watering and I'm taking care of it, and I'm just like, oh Jesus, okay, well, I'm kind of like this garden. I constantly need work. I'm always needing maintenance. I'm always sprouting up bad thoughts and things that aren't actually suiting me very well and aren't helping me in any way or other people. They're sort of these weird little, vile temptations or thoughts that I ought to just do away with. That I'm kind of like that. And I want to be this, ideal garden, sort of like the Plato ideal, right, of the shadows on the cave. And so I kind of finally realized that snapped into my head, and I formed kind of a sort of an ethos off of that. And I thought, well, I will from this point forward recognize that I am imperfect and in constant need of tending, and I will just I'll keep refining my understanding of what I'm aiming for here. But I at least know that like I'll never get to who I want to be, because that's too far away. But I will start aiming for it, and ever since then things have just, for me, they've gotten better exponentially, and it wasn't because I was looking for things to get better exponentially necessarily. I was just looking for me and my relationships to improve, and putting that first has clarified so much of life in a way that nothing else ever had. And just recently, just in the last year or so, I've started to bleed that in with Christian doctrine. And so this will take us to C.S. Lewis, because one of the people that I like a lot these days to hear their thoughts about this stuff is Jordan Peterson. We've talked about him on the podcast a couple of times. I think I've even talked to you about him briefly. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that he blew my mind with was the idea that whether or not God and Satan literally exist, the world operates as if their existence was the case. Mm-hmm. So I find that to be undeniably true. I haven't gotten to a point where I know if I think that the devil and the God literally exist. That's why I'm somewhere between atheist and Christian, I suppose. Mm-hmm. But just trying to govern my behavior with the understanding that the world operates as if they exist has also clarified things for me and made
which is also rational, because it happens to be my three disciplines in college was religion, speech communication, and sociology. Sociologically, I don't know of any culture that does not premise that reality.
That there's a good and an evil. Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah, exactly.
And personifies it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and acts it out and ritualizes it and symbolizes it.
And makes it a story.
And turns it into a narrative, exactly. And these grand narratives are sort of at the underlying substructure of our societies. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to once say that the Screw Tape Letters, just to throw a plug out there to anybody who's listening, that's one of the best books I've ever read. It's just a short novel. It is so clever. It's so witty. It's enthrallingly interesting. It's the perspective that it's written from is just genius. C.S. Lewis was so multi-talented. I mean, the fact that he could write so lucidly through fiction and nonfiction is just the coolest thing. So I'd like to read more of him. But this book in particular was interesting for me because I already had that.
Great Divorce by him?
Not yet, no, but I have a list. So that just the idea that the world operates as if God and the devil existed. Mm-hmm. Either way, I really think the Screw Tape Letters does a good job of getting to that point, because it's all told from the perspective of a couple of devils who are basically trying to tempt this individual through life to get him to sort of turn away from God and towards the Father below, they call him. Anyway, really interesting, cool book. So my question for you that I had a second ago was about the history of societies and the religious stories that underlie those societies in the substructure of them. So I think of Islam in the Middle East. I think of Judeo-Christian for Western society. I think of Hinduism for India, Buddhism for China. What are your thoughts about how those underlying narratives affect the long-term outcome of the well-being of those societies and the people that inhabit them?
Well, first of all those narratives at some level tend to purge themselves, meaning they tend to move towards goodness and away from evil in one form or another. Some are horrific and use violent, including the biblical story, use violence to that end, and some are exceptionally pure. I think Buddhism is closer to a purer faith in terms of the issue of violence, although it's intrinsic, I guess, in the experience of the monks, and I don't really...
There's not a lot of violent Buddha. Yeah. There's I think some cases, but it's not very common.
Exactly. I don't know what I'm talking about when we're talking in that area. I only know the broad picture.
I mean, you both.
But having said that, the one thing that's interesting, I think, which makes me really like the Jesus story, is that it's ever enlarging. At least my experience of the Jesus story. In other words, it's the only, and I realize that we really push back against meta-narratives now because we want to respect the value of each cultural expression of the narrative, and that's valid, except that I think all these, if there is a story that is large enough that all these other narratives ultimately fall into it, then that's the story I choose. And I think the Judeo-Christian story is that story.
You think it encompasses all the stories?
Exactly. So that at the end of the day, a person, a Muslim, who seeks the peace to know this God of peace, that the Muslim faith at its heart talks about, even though it is rooted in a very violent narrative early and coming from one person's tradition. I mean, it really is. It's unlike the biblical view that was written over 1,500 years or 1,000 years at least of experience. This story really is rooted in a certain culture, a certain time, a certain man. Nevertheless, there are billions of Muslims today, and many of which, perhaps most of which, I don't know the stats, don't know them well enough, who have come to understand that God is good and God is peaceful. And I believe, I have no doubt, that either in this life, and of course they recognize Jesus, they don't recognize Jesus as the eternal Son of God, but as a prophet, and believe that the end of the age as they understand it will happen when Jesus returns. So we share that story. But I have no doubt on an individual basis that there will be millions, billions of Muslims who die in good faith, who are pursuing this goodness just as you and I are, and who, if they haven't had the opportunity of awakening to the universe as it really is, and I'm getting to an answer to your question, that when they see life beyond this 70 years, they will say with Thomas of old, my Lord and my God. In other words, they will awaken to the God who is. And it will be Jesus's human experience, life, teachings, death, passion, resurrection, ascension, and now praying in the heart of the Trinity and unfolding each of our individual narratives before the Father and the Spirit in a transformative way, that they will realize they were never alone. And the cross was always present to them. And God was hearing their prayers. Not because the heart of Muslim is good, it's not, but because the heart of God is good. So I see the Christian story as the largest of all the stories I've heard.